This tutorial is on how to use your manual machine to do tuck lace. I'm using the Brother KH230. I downloaded some punch card designs to use as a guide, and we're going to be manually selecting needles to achieve these lacy fabrics. This is a scan of the Singer number 3 punch card. I downloaded this on the internet, and I can tell that it will work for tuck stitch because the white areas are the areas that are going to be allowed to tuck, and this needle will tuck for 4 rows, and then it will shift over, and then this needle will tuck for 4 rows. And you don't want 2 needles side by side that are going to tuck. And then when you see these for a tuck stitch card, these will knit when you have your punch card machine set on tuck. But with a manual machine, we're going to have to do all of this manually. We're going to have to make sure the correct needles are set up. When you're looking at these punch cards, you'll see the dots on the side, and they're a little bit smaller than the other dots, and that's the tractor feed system. So we ignore those dots, and we also ignore the dots at the top, the 2 rows at the top and the 2 rows at the bottom, because that was how punch cards were joined together on the machine so that they would turn continuously through the feeder. When I'm setting this design up, I noticed that there's only 8 rows that repeat, so I'm not going to pay attention to the rest of the card. I renumbered the rows because the numbers on the card itself have nothing to do with the row that they're next to. That is something that you see when you have it in your feeder on your punch card, and it's actually representing what the machine is fixing to knit, which usually is about 5 stitches down on a Singer machine. So we're going to ignore those numbers. And I also mark the center of the panel because I'm going to arrange my needles in a certain way, and it's easier for me to know where 0 is. So I counted 12 stitches over, and I put a line down the middle. And this is a 24 stitch card. So I also marked out these circles on the side so I wouldn't get confused about what they were. And what the yellow highlight is, I decided that this column of needles, or this needle, would be put out of work. And when you're studying a punch card design that you want to use, look for a long area where there are no tuck stitches. And you can use those needles to choose as the needles you want to put out of work. So we're going to start putting out of work the needles, the needle that is to the right of center and every 4th needle over. And on the first row of our design, I can see that the first tuck stitch that I want to get the needle selected is to the left of that out of work needle. So using this, I'm going to set up my needles, and it's every 4th needle over is going to be a tuck stitch in both directions. Set your carriage levers on both sides of the carriage to H to hold the needles that we select. And then set your row counter to 0 to help you keep track of where you are in the pattern. For my practice piece, I already had 30 stitches cast on, so I'm going to just use those as my base. Normally you would calculate how many you need to cast on to do the pattern repeats, but it doesn't matter for this practice piece. So looking at my pattern again, I'm going to first select the tuck stitches. It's easier to do it that way. So I noticed that the first tuck stitch in this 4 pattern, or this 4 row pattern repeat, the first tuck stitch is to the left of 0, and that's that little white area right there. That's a tuck stitch, and it's every 4th needle to the left and to the right. So I'm going to select that needle first and pull it all the way out to the E position, which is the holding position. And then I'm going to select every fourth needle. And you can use a tool if you have one. One thing you don't want to do is select the end needles on either side. Those need to stay and work. So I have all of my tuck stitches selected now. Looking at the pattern again, these are the needles that I selected, these white areas. And now I need to transfer stitches to put some needles out of work. So I'm going to start with the one that is to the right of 0. And I also notice that all the tuck stitches on these 4 rows are going to be to the left of the out of work needles. So I'm going to just start in the middle here to keep on track. And you just take the stitch off of the needle and transfer it over to its neighbor. This is a tuck stitch, so we're not going to put it on that needle. And again, make sure you're not doing anything to the outside needles. So I'm moving over to the left now, but I'm still transferring the needle that's to the right of the tuck stitch. And then I want to double check and make sure all the needles that I have emptied are now in non-working position. So with the carriage set on hold on both side levers, and for plain knitting, we're going to knit across. And that's row 1, and we have 1 tuck stitch on the needles. So I'm going to knit back across. That's row 2, 3. At this point, I can decide whether I want to do a plain row for the 4th row. And this sample is one that I did that with. There's a plain row in between each of the pattern repeats. But I like the one that I did not include the plain rows. To me, the diamonds are a little bit more defined. So if you want to let the machine automatically knit these needles back to working position, you would put the carriage on normal on the right hand side, knit across, and it'll knit these stitches and put them back into work, and you don't have to manually do it. But I'm going to be doing the design where I let it do the tuck stitches for 4 rows, and I won't be messing with my levers. I'll leave them on hold for the entire time. So I'm going to go ahead and knit my 4th row across, and that'll be the last row of that first pattern repeat. So now we need to move up to this section here, and I can see that the tuck stitches now are to the right of the out of work needles. These highlighted columns are the needles that are out of work. So my tuck stitches are now to the right of those out of work needles. First step is to put the previously tucked stitches back into work. And most knitting machine beds have marks on the bed showing where that forward working position is. All of these needles in these 2 areas will knit. This is the main working area, and this is the forward working needles. You don't want to shove these all the way back because your stitches will fall off. So now I've got those ready to knit, and I need to choose the tuck stitches for the next 4 rows. And so I determined that they were to the right of the out of work needles. So you can clearly see your out of work needles back here at the back. And so what I do is I find that out of work needle, and then I choose the one to the right. There's another out of work, and the needle that's directly to the right. being careful not to choose the end needle. I can see that if I choose this one, I still have the end needle that's okay, so I can go ahead and select that needle. So now all of these needles that are pulled all the way out will do the tuck stitches, and these will knit back. Now I'm going to knit row 5 through 8. So now you can see that the tuck stitches have been knit back into working position. You can see the 4 loops that were built up on that stitch. And that is what causes that fabric to pull up and make that design. So that's row 7 and row 8. Now we just repeat back to row 1 again, put these needles back into work. And then I'm looking at my chart, and it's the tuck stitches are going to be to the left of the out of work needles. I can also use my tool to do this. So here's an out of work needle, but I don't want to choose that stitch because it's my end stitch. And now I knit the first 4 rows of the pattern. And you put these back into work and do the second repeat. The tuck stitches are to the right of the needles out of work. It's a little bit slower than using a punch cord machine, but it still can be done. So that's row 5, 6, 7, 8. Now you can clearly see the pattern in the fabric. And so when we decide we're done with the lace part of our knitting and we want to go back to plain knitting and maybe bind off after a few rows, we have to put these empty needles back into work. But I can't just simply put them back in work and start knitting, because then you're going to end up with a hole in your fabric like I did here on one of my practice pieces. I pulled the needles back into work, but I didn't fill them up with a new stitch. So what we're going to do is what I call a make one, and we're going to find the empty needle and we're going to go to the first logical stitch that we can borrow from. Obviously we don't want to mess with our tuck stitch here, so I'm going to go to this needle that's to the left of this empty needle, and I'm going to grab that little purl bump that is directly below the needle, and I'm going to pull it up and deposit it onto that empty needle. And I'm going to do that all the way across the bed for all of those empty needles. And that will close up the hole that was created when we put those needles out of work. And now we need to set our carriage to normal, which is the end on the 2 levers on either side of the carriage. And we can just start knitting, and all of these needles will be allowed to knit. So you can see that even with a manual machine, you can still use old punch card designs to manually make your machine do what the punch cards normally tell the machine to do.